Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. No special announcements or anything, so let's just dive right in. First up, over on Patreon, Dan Bailey wanted to chime in on the whole extension cord, adding latency, what other things that you could see from it conversation. And they said, while not latency related, it's worth noting that with the unusual design of the TurboGrafx Duo PC Engine multi-taps, cheap generic extension cables from Monoprice and some other suppliers seem to work fine for individual controllers, but were having problems when plugged into the Duo Tap or Turbo Tap to the system itself. They always suspected this was due to attenuation and possibly unshielded extension cables, but they think it's worth noting that problems can pop up besides just latency when using controller extension cables. So yeah, that's another one that I completely forgot to touch upon. Another is light guns. And some people originally thought maybe you couldn't be so far away from a TV, which has something to do with it, but also some NES extension cords don't have all of the pins run, so the extra pin that was needed for light guns just wasn't connected. So even if you plug in the extension cord and go an inch away from your TV, that still won't work. So Dan, great point bringing that up. There's always a lot to talk about when it comes to extension cables, but the general advice from last time was still what I would stick with, in that buy it, try it, and kind of go from there. Try to get it from places that allow returns, try to get it from reputable places, and just kind of go from there. And certainly in the case of the multi-taps and stuff like that, try plugging it controller into the extension cable into the multi-tap, and then from the multi-tap into the console, and just do all of the troubleshooting first to see what would happen. But yeah, I would also, just out of my own nerdy curiosity, like to know what the answer is for the multi-tap. Is it that it's not all of the pins wired like with some of the NES stuff? Is it shielding or cable thickness or attenuation or something like that? If anybody happens to know the answer, that would be pretty neat. But yeah, I mean, always when it comes to extension cables, latency is not what I would worry about. It was everything else: connection, quality, stuff like the turbo taps, all the pins being wired. But it's a great point, so thanks for bringing it up. Next up, Oliver Clare said they're planning on getting a GDEMU Dreamcast at the end of the month. They're considering upgrading it to the Terra Onion mode, and they've read several articles and watched videos about it, but they haven't been very helpful. So, firstly, leaving aside pricing and opinions about Terra Onion and Alex generally, which ODE do I think is objectively better? And then secondly, if I had a perfectly fine GDEMU, would I subjectively feel any need to upgrade to the mode? Would the improvements, if any, justify the cost, in my own opinion? So that exact scenario is what I'm going to answer, but then I'm also going to kind of go back to this. So the scenario you're talking about is you already own a Dreamcast with a GDEMU installed. Or I guess in your case, you're picking up a Dreamcast that already has one installed. You want to know if you should upgrade. In that scenario specifically, I would wait to see if Fixel's ODE solution is going to be an upgrade to both of those things. Now, very specifically, the scenario of you already own a Dreamcast with a GDEMU. If you don't have any ODE, I would never say wait unless this is something that's not so important to you in the short term. Like, you're going to be gone for the summer or whatever. Because, it's always a thing of, there's always the option of waiting for the next best thing. And I don't mean the slightest bit of disrespect to Fixel or any of the other developers out there trying to get these really hard to make projects out. It's just, the reality is, maybe it's going to get delayed. Maybe it's going to show up early. We don't know. So if you already have a GDEMU and you're not really in a rush to get this done, I would actually wait to see what Fixel's solution does. Because it's my opinion that if you're already having a setup like Oliver's, where there's a ton of consoles and a lot of stuff networked together, being able to load games over Wi-Fi, even if you have to purchase another adapter for Fixels, I think that's going to be such a huge upgrade, because you're not managing managing large files going back and forth between SD or USB media and back to your computer. You could just have it on your main server. So I think that's going to be a pretty big deal. However, in the situation of you don't own any ODE at all, you have a Dreamcast, and right now you want to start loading up homebrew and patches on an ODE, the mode is definitely better. And the number one thing about it, by far, is that to load games on a mode, You take a USB stick or a SATA drive or whatever else, you create some folder structure based on their instructions. I think you create just a Dreamcast folder and you load your games. And that's it. It's about as easy as every ROM cart on the planet. Whereas the GDMU, you need the custom software. Sometimes you need to patch stuff. It's a giant pain. And, respect to the original developer who came out with that, because no one had really done that in that way before. There were other solutions, but there was nothing that really hit popularity as much. So, it was great for its time, but I'm really looking forward to seeing the next generation of stuff. And the mode technically counts as that. So, my suggestion for anybody today who needs an ODE right now, the mode is really excellent for the Dreamcast. Or I guess if your laser's still working, you could burn CDRs, but that's not the greatest idea. For a temporary solution, that's fine. But if you already have an ODE for your Dreamcast, I would just kind of wait to see. And maybe Fixels is going to come out. And maybe it's going to perform exactly like the mode, and then you just choose whichever you prefer. Maybe it's going to be better. Maybe the mode's going to be better for the Dreamcast, but Fixels is going to be better for something else. We won't know until we start installing these things. What I would really have loved to have seen, which I don't think Fixels can do, is some kind of way to have an optical drive emulator and keep original CD functionality. Most people don't really care about that, and if you really wanted to, you could always swap it back in, but I always love solutions where you get to retain the original experience, and that is something that I definitely want that I almost never use. Almost every single time I try to play a game on original hardware, it's with a ROM cart or with an ODE or something, but occasionally I just, for whatever reason, whether it's testing or nostalgia or to show somebody else, I want to put that original disc in. So my little rant about that dual booting aside, the answer to your question is, for you personally, Oliver, I'd probably wait. For anybody else, just have a think about it. But if you don't have an ODE solution at all, and you really just wanted to know which one is better, technically the mode is definitely better, if nothing else, for ROM loading. In options of media, you're not just limited to micro SD. You could use USB or SATA, which the total cost of the mode, that's kind of where you should have your head. If you just have a small USB stick or a small micro SD card and you only load the games that you want to use, the GDMU is infinitely cheaper. But if you want to get a 2 terabyte SATA drive and put every Dreamcast ROM and homebrew and everything right on there, it's going to be way cheaper to go with the mode than it would be the GDMU and a 2 terabyte SD card. So that's the only thing I would say for now. But I'm really interested to see Fixel stuff, because I have a feeling there's going to be stuff there that's pretty interesting to people, if nothing else, the network stuff. Tony Escobar recently bought an old school branded N64 AC adapter as a backup power adapter. However, they were wondering if I had any recommendations for N64 PSUs. They don't want to ruin their amazing N64 digital purple fantastic N64. So, I mean, you just nailed it right there. You have an N64 that's important to you, that you had the N64 digital installed in. So in that scenario, I would never use that old school branded power supply. Maybe it's fine. I haven't taken it apart and done a full analysis on it, but that brand is really known for making kind of garbage. So if you use that as a backup just to like test something real quick, or, if you had a stock N64 that suddenly didn't turn on one day and you plugged in the old school one just to test it, that should be fine. But if you have a rare and expensive model, or you have one that you've already modded, I would only use original PSUs, or the one that Game Tech had been showing recently. I'll pull it up here, but there was a universal PSU that Jason had been selling, and it's expensive though. So I want to make sure I put this into perspective. The price is $55, including the cover, but you still have to buy an external power brick. And you could get the one that is recommended that I used as well, that is $21. And there's a few advantages to this. It is kind of neat. It's an upgrade where you remove the brick and put that on the outside. It's fully international, so that if you ever bounce between countries, or if you go to sell it, you could use it anywhere. It is brand new PSU stuff, so you're not worried about using 20, 30-year-old stuff. But it's expensive, right? I mean, like, it's $80 total after shipping and taxes and all that stuff. maybe a little bit more, that's a lot of money. So I completely and totally understand if people are like, oh, I don't want to spend all that much money on an N64 power supply. Trying to find an original Nintendo branded one, I'm not sure how much cheaper it would get, but it would definitely be a little bit safer. So this is one of those things where if you're listening and you have a stock N64 and you don't have the budget for stuff like this, I understand going to the old school one. It's really hard to tell people to spend money on something when I don't have any proof that that one is bad. But if you have the budget to do so, I would definitely get stuff like this just because of peace of mind. You have this plug and play adapter. You don't need to disassemble your N64. Everything just kind of goes right in. You have the external brick. I really, my gut's telling me that this is definitely the much safer bet to go through than one of those branded third-party junk stuff like that. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that old school brand, maybe they did a ton of research and development to get you the most cost-effective power supply that you could rely on for your N64. What do you think the chances of that are, though? So I don't know. I would really consider this over that as well as the originals in your situation, but I completely understand if that's not something that's in your budget. Next, is there any word on Pixel FX PSX digital release date? They had talked about revealing something soon, but I don't want to speak out of turn here. I will wait until they're ready to actually say it, but I don't think it's super far off. But I've said that before. I said that about HD Retrovision's Dreamcast cables like 12 years ago, so hey, we'll see. Next up, Adam Adaman recently got bit. I love that, by the way. That's very funny. But continuing, they bought a PS2 network card SSD upgrade and looked at the image of where they bought it from and didn't see their name on the board anywhere on the pictures in the store. But when they received it, they opened it up, and it is, of course, made by the notorious cloner Bitfunks. And by the way, once again, that's one person doing all of that. There's a company, but this isn't like a group of people. There's one person cloning all of these things. So who can they get those from that is not a cloner? And that's one of those weird situations where I don't know anything about that. Maybe it's not a clone. Maybe it's an open source design. And while that company is, without a shadow of a doubt, a clone company, as well as Kaiko and a couple others that aren't as bad. And a little side note, if you ever see anybody say that they're not, they're paid to say that. There's one drama channel idiot that went out there and did a video about how they're not cloners. They got paid to do it. Maybe they got paid in free stuff. Maybe they got paid in cash. I don't care. So immediately distrust anybody that tries to claim that Bitfunks or Kaiko are not a clone company. But, that stupid saying is right. A broken clock is right twice a day. Just because they are horrible clone companies doesn't mean that every single piece that comes out of there is a clone. So maybe it is a clone, maybe it's not. The one thing that you do need to remember is, and Adam, I'm not blaming you for this, I'll get back to this in a second, but the one thing that you do need to remember is that when you buy anything from a clone company, even stuff that is completely legit, maybe even something that is their complete original design, you're still funding them to steal more things. You're still giving them money to allow them to build their business, to steal more stuff, to take money away from good people who are sitting there and designing this. But the problem that Adam has is the problem that a lot of people have, and that there are a few things that Bitfunks has kind of taken over the market on. And it is very likely that someone was making these by hand. Bitfunks went and made the cheapest possible version with low quality components that barely works and undercut the original maker by 50%. So the original maker just stopped making them. And now Bitfunks has to dump all of this stock of all of that stuff out there, so they resell it through other channels. So while that might not be what has happened, that is very likely, and it has happened before with other clone products that Bitfunks has made. So the honest answer is you might not actually be able to have an alternative that you purchase from. So that kind of puts us all in a weird position, because what if you want that exact product, which is a pretty cool product? What do you do then? And in that case, there's really no choice. So I wouldn't shame somebody from accidentally buying from a clone company anyway, but the only people I shame are people that come into the comments like, oh, who would pay for this retro tank? I guess this person who made the video is too stupid to ever look up Bitfunks. No, I'm going to shame that person. You ass. No, Bitfunks is the clone company. But for just buying something, no, absolutely not. And this is the case where it's like, you know what? Pick a random eBay seller wherever, in whatever country you're located in, and just kind of hope for the best. Hope you buy from somebody that doesn't even know they're a clone company. Because that's the other thing too. And I know I'm going to probably this is probably an answer that was way longer and off topic than Adam wanted, but you have to also understand that a lot of companies that resell this stuff have no clue that they're a clone company. All they do is they go through all of the different white box resellers out in different countries and say, okay, well, I like this, and this product. I think product A is going to be a big seller, so could you put my name on it? Products B, C, and D, just send them as is. I'll just keep stock of them. And they have no idea who they're buying from. They don't know if they're a reseller themselves. They don't know if they're original manufacturer of all of this. And sometimes people do their diligence and really try to check into things, but it's impossible to get all of that right. So while I hope that people who resell their products start to realize through people like us who keep talking about it, I hope they start to realize that they shouldn't be putting orders in anymore. It is very likely, Adam, that you purchased it from a store that is a reputable store that is good otherwise, that didn't even know that they were a clone company. But to answer your question, 5 minutes later, I don't know where to get a version of that that's legit. And I think there's one person who's considering making the whole thing, including the plastic piece that plugs in, like everything that you would need to make this happen. But I don't know how far away that is. So if you're waiting on this now, just try to find a store that that isn't that at least seems reputable. Because I've found stores that I bought stuff from that have been fine, that all of a sudden a Bitfunks product has popped up, and it's like, do I reach out and explain to them, or do I just look like a complete ass? So I just try to stay out of it, to be honest, mostly because I just don't have the time to do any of that. But yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but I have no idea where to get any. I don't even know where that project truly originated from. So if anybody has any info on that, please let me know. And you're always welcome to share your thoughts in the comments. And I always listen to people's opposing opinions on this stuff. But there are a group of trolls out there, and I can't understand if they're really trolls or if they're people that genuinely don't understand. But there's a whole bunch of people that come in and say you're a hypocrite because you download a ROM from a 40-year-old console that you can't buy the game anywhere anymore, but you don't like clone companies. That's the same thing. It's not the same thing. If I need to explain that to you, you might not want to listen to any of the rest of my videos. You might want to kind of figure yourself out here. Next up, Jason Guffey wants to know what I could tell them about Hall effect joysticks, specifically as upgrades for existing controllers such as Switch Joy-Cons or PlayStation controllers all the way up to PS5. So I don't know much about those. I don't have any experience with them. And even though I talk to a lot of pro gamers that use modern stuff, that's never been a conversation that's come up yet. The basic overview is Hall effect joysticks use a different method of accomplishing what an analog joystick does, with less of a dead zone and less wear and tear over time. I do know that I'm pretty sure there's an 8-bit DOE Switch controller that uses this in place of analog sticks, but I'm not really sure if there's anything for the PlayStation. But honestly, this is something that I don't know much about, and I'd so much rather look at this camera and say, I don't know, than try to BS my way through it. So I'm sorry I don't have more info, but that's something you might want to keep researching on your own. But I'll leave a link to the 8-bit DOE controller just in case that might be something people are interested in. And also, Jason was recently trying to get back into Mister stuff to purchase their first Mister, and they realized that even though last week I talked about the HD15 to SCART, those things ended up selling out immediately. Ryan switched it to pre-orders. The next batch should be here fairly quickly, certainly not like a year delay like part shortage-esque stuff that's been happening with that. But if you need a solution right now for the D-sub to SCART adapter for use with the Mister or the analog DAC, you could very easily just get a VG or a D-sub VGA style to SCART cable with the correct resistor in it. I'll leave a link to that post that describes it. The post title is clickbaity just because I wanted people to see it, but the post itself is not. So please just try to look past that. I try to almost never use clickbait unless I really want people to look at something. And that was one where there might be a safety issue, but if it's going to be the same price to get a cable that has zero safety issue, why wouldn't you just do that? So it's kind of the point of that post. So that's definitely a good option. Now, there are a couple of alternative options. You mentioned asking if there's any projects that have an I/O board with a SCART output built in. The Mr. Multi-System does. You just have to note that in the case. I think you have to either get a slightly different case with it or modify it. I can't quite remember because I don't use the SCART output on mine, but that one has one. You could also use the Retro Castle case that has a Saturn mini DIN, which is awesome. The latest version of that, I'll leave a link to this too, but the latest version of it has the Mike Simone converter built in, or the Luma trap. So if you set your Mister to S-Video mode, and remember, I failed miserably on that stream the other day, even if you're using composite, set it to S-Video mode, you could just use Sega Saturn S-Video and composite cables and get really good quality S-Video and composite, or you could use a Saturn RGB SCART cable and get RGB from that. The only issue is, I'm assuming that you're probably going to want to mess with this on VGA monitors as well. So if you wanted that case, you could just use direct video to get, or direct video with the line doubler, or you could just simply use a HDMI to VGA converter, that same Ranky one that I mentioned last week. You could definitely do that. And in fact, if you wanted to, you could even use that exact solution to have your SCART cable on an RGB monitor and your VGA cable with the line double mode on your VGA CRT monitor for that. You could certainly do that as well. So if composite and S-Video were things that you were even considering, that's absolutely your best option, no doubt, because you could have it all. The only thing you wouldn't really be able to do is have 1080p output, 480p output, and 15 kilohertz output all at the same time. You wouldn't be able to do 3. You would just be able to choose 2 of those. Or, of course, you could also just get any of the Mr. cases with the VGA D-sub style outputs. Retro Castle has those as well. And I believe on the Retro Castle store, you can get the entire kit, everything, the DE10, the RAM module, the newest I/O board with the Mike Simone Luma trap, really nice choice of cases, everything delivered for under $500, which is pretty cool. It's not a huge savings from doing everything piece by piece, but I went to order a DE10 from Terrasic the other day, and it was like almost $300 just for that. The shipping went up a lot. Their price went up a bit. So, I think it's almost beneficial to get your DE10 elsewhere these days. But hopefully that will put everything into perspective for you and kind of give you a good idea of what to choose for your setup. But Jason, after talking with you in these Q&As for a while, my gut's telling me you're going to want the Retro Castle with the Saturn mini DIN output, because that will allow you to do everything on every CRT or flat panel that Mister could possibly offer for you. So maybe consider that one. I'll leave a link in the description. And if you want one of the D-sub ones, that's awesome too. I'll just I'll leave a link to that post as to why you can't just use a basic pass-through cable. You probably can use a basic pass-through cable, but why you probably wouldn't want to. Now over on Floatplane, Kirko said they have a cheap action replay style cart from AliExpress that they use with their Sega Saturn. If they just leave it in the system, do I think it's doing more damage than removing it and reinserting it? They probably play it once a week at most at the moment. So, some background for anybody that doesn't understand the question. A lot of these action replay carts and a lot of the RAM carts that you would see for the Sega Saturn are not beveled. And I thought some of them might even be the improper thickness. So what it was ending up doing was smashing up the cartridge slot in the Saturn to the point where most people now can't just plug the cartridge in. You have to fold up an index card and stick it behind it, or bend the pins manually back yourself. And it's unfortunately the perfect example of why you always want carts with beveled edges, because this is exactly what happens when you don't. And unlike an NES where you could just pop off the 72-pin connector, it's pretty hard to replace those connectors on a Saturn. So the question is, if you don't really have a choice because you can't really find really well-built carts like that for the Saturn, what's the least worst? Do you carefully insert it once and just never remove it? Or do you take it out when you're not using it? Because what if the PCB is a tiny bit too thick? I don't know the true answer, but my gut is telling me leave it in. And, leave it in and just kind of hope for the best. Because if it is the proper thickness, you should be fine. You should be fine for a long time. If it's the excuse me, if it's the improper thickness, you're going to be doing the damage anyway, but at least this way you don't end up smashing those pins every time you insert it. Now, if you need to take it out, if there's a game that's not compatible with it, if you have to swap to something else, that's one thing, do what you got to do. But if you have the option to just leave it in, I probably would do that and just kind of hope for the best. And there were a couple of options being floated around. And there was even that one cart that supposedly was starting to be able to run games off of the cartridge. I hope stuff like that gets completed, and I hope whoever makes those absolutely bends over backwards to make the thickness the exact correct width and to have those properly beveled. And hard gold contacts are nice, but that's less of an issue. Some of my nerd friends don't agree with this, but it is my strong opinion that it's the much lesser of an issue than getting the cartridge beveled in the right size, having the voltage correct, and then having the pads correct as well. So my gut's telling me leave it in. If anybody thinks for whatever reason I'm wrong, please chime in, and chime in with some facts too, just so I can understand why I might be wrong. But I think that's going to be your safest bet. So I would do that. And if your Saturn and your Action Replay card are running, maybe you luckily got one that is beveled. I don't really know, but if it's all working and you don't have to mess with it at all, I would leave well enough alone, leave it in, and kind of go from there. Well, that's it for this week. If you're new to these Q&As and you want to ask a question, ask wherever it is that you support, but please do so in the latest Q&A post, because the way these services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, I really like just scrolling through in real time like you see here, as if we were sitting across from each other at a bar or a coffee shop or something, just having a laid-back conversation. So any questions at all, fire away. Just do it wherever it is you support. And if for whatever reason I miss your question, it's probably because it came in after I stopped recording, but before I uploaded it. So if I ever miss anything, either DM me or just ask again in next week's, and I'll get to it then. So as always, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.